Hello, everyone. I hope you've all enjoyed this set of courses as much as I have. So I'm going to jump right into presenting you my final project, Pacific Salmon and Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management, Expanding Indigenous Leadership to Reduce Risk. So my core argument here is that current Pacific salmon governance is fragmented and uneven in its incorporation of Indigenous authority and ecosystem-based fisheries management principles. Expanding formal tribal decision-making authority within co-management structures is going to strengthen responsiveness in social structures while also reducing the ecological risk. Everything I'm going to walk you through right now is going to build on that conclusion. So let's take a look. Why does this fishery matter? Pacific salmon are more than just a managed stock. They're an ecologically foundational species. They connect freshwater and marine ecosystems and support entire food webs. This species is notoriously significant amongst various cultures, ecologically critical, and economically significant across the entire Pacific Northwest. They provide food security for thousands across the region through subsistence fishing, feast for predators, especially that apex predator looking to beef up before its hibernation, and massive amounts of energy for neighboring forests. This is not a single species issue. It is a social ecological system which ties directly to what we've learned throughout this entire course. So let's take a look at my network diagram in the current governance landscape. One of the biggest takeaways from this course for me has been that fisheries are not just biological systems, they're coupled social ecological systems. In my network diagram, you can see here that salmon biomass sits at the center, but it's shaped by climate variability, hydropower and dams, fishing effort, hatchery practices, governance structures, and indigenous harvest. Each of these components interacts. None of them operate in isolation, so management decisions do not just affect the fish. They alter feedbacks across the entire system. Current salmon governance operates through layered federal, state, and tribal co-management frameworks. While treaty rights do exist, some tribal co-management is legally recognized in places like Western Washington. Decision-making authority is still often centralized, slow to adapt, fragmented across jurisdictions. We see that hatchery management, hydroelectric dam policy, harvest regulation, and habitat restoration are often all managed singularly instead of collectively. And so we'll look at a couple examples and we'll see how that in Western Washington, it's playing out where, yes, it may be a little bit recognized, but it's not being used to its full advantage. So let's look at some major stressors and key sources of uncertainty. So when we look at the system, several major stressors stand out. Climate change and warming water temperatures affect both freshwater and marine survival. Hydropower and habitat fragmentation restrict migration and alter flow regimes. And fishing pressure and bycatch rate create direct reduction risk to the biomass. Hatchery supplementation introduces trade-offs between short-term and long-term genetic or ecological concerns. And importantly, the governance itself acts as a stressor by slowing the adaptive response and in creating this large amount of fragmentation. So uncertainty isn't something we can eliminate, right? It's something that needs to be managed. And so that's something that's a major theme. Environmental variability across the freshwater and marine phases makes prediction difficult. And so there's gaps, right? Especially regarding the gaps in social responses. Human behavior doesn't always respond predictably to compliance, right? Or regulation. So that governance itself and the effectiveness is varying across the region and across jurisdictions where tribal networks are actually recognized and where they're not, right? So let's look. So that current management framework that I just walked you through a little bit, right? So currently they are managed through that combination of federal, state, and tribal authorities. There are some places, and particularly in Western Washington, where that treaty-based co-management exists, right? So there are some places where it's not absent of indigenous involvement, but it's just that it's not well established, right? So the incorporation of the indigenous authority is not there, it's uneven, and so the principles that are not, are the principles that are there, right, are not being placed to the scale of management. So there are quotas, there are seasonal closures, there's gear restrictions, there's hatchery programs, and there's even habitat restoration efforts. But it's not consistent everywhere, right? And so the authority is often shared unevenly, and the integration of the indigenous leadership in the actual decision making, right, is not there. And that's what would allow for a better ecosystem-based fisheries management framework because it's not universal. So let's look, right? What are the limitations of the current framework? So where co-management does exist, like I was mentioning in some parts of Western Washington, very small parts, their incorporation of that authority varies extremely widely, right? It's treaty based. So it's really not indigenous authority decision making, right? So it's more like consultation, you could say. So habitat and harvest are managed as separate domains a lot of times, which really contradicts one another when you look closer. And the indigenous knowledge is not always fully embedded in decision-making processes, right? So those are political constraints right there that delay responsiveness. And so those are some components that are present, but they're not integrated, right? And so that fragmentation right there completely and clearly exists. So, what is my approach, right? The alternative approach that I propose is not a completely new structure, but an expansion, right? So, specifically expanding the indigenous leadership within the formal co-management structures, right? This means moving beyond the consultation phases and towards a shared, strengthened decision-making authority in regions where the treaty rights and historical stewardship are already recognized, right? So, you can start out with what you've got. You can already move beyond that phase in places where the stewardship and the authority is already recognized, just not being implemented. So embed those principles more fully in the governance structure, and then we'll have a better ecosystem-based fisheries management structure. So this is my alternate management network, right? So you can see that a couple of the things on the left moved a little bit, right? That one line didn't want to go straight, so it got a little wonky. And so I have governance and stakeholders moving all the way down to spawning habitat, because once you integrate that indigenous firsthand leadership and observation, right, and management, you're going to have spawning habitats, and habitats become managed collectively, right? They're not going to be managed now as one separately in habitat restoration efforts and all this other stuff. You're going to see, you know, I want to say quotas, but you're going to see habitats managed right alongside things of that nature, right? So, um, what I'm proposing here is that several system level changes are going to take place, right? You're going to see that the monitoring and the restoration, like I just said, is going to become more responsive to the local signals, right? So the environmental signals are going to have more, I guess you could say, they're going to have more weight to them because they're going to be picked up sooner, right? So they're not just going to be signals that are out there flapping in the wind, as you could say. So the harvest decisions are going to be more adaptive and right community is going to be more involved. So let's take a closer look at risk then, right? So what are my risk assessments? And when comparing the risk assessments, what did they look like? So when I started comparing risk assessments, several things started to come through and shifts started to emerge, right? So that under the alternative scenario, things started to shift, right? So I saw things like habitat degradation and governance instability decline. Social resilience obviously is going to increase, right? Because we're adding a layer of community structure. And so that is all going to further reduce the element of risk, right? So climate variability is obviously going to remain persistent because that's an external risk that right now, right, we are trying our best to control. But that's something that trickles down into that habitat, right? That spawning habitat. What is the risk to that habitat, right? So while we're looking at the overall climate and we're looking at the species overall, right? That's part of ecosystem-based fisheries management. What I'm trying to make here is if you look at the alternative framework, you can see that climate response risk shifted out of the red and into the yellow, right? Because I believe that when you're looking at the habitat more closely, right, the response of climate change is going to go down, right? So while it's still present, right, the impact is going to be less likely because you're more aware and in tune of your surroundings, right? So overall, this approach is going to reduce risk because it aligns the authority and that long-standing stewardship that's in place with the current governance systems, right? It's going to strengthen the adaptive capacity, you could say, while it's also, right, increasing the transparency of government and increasing its legitimacy and, right, reducing the delay of response, right, like we said. So let's look at a couple, I guess you could say, proven factors of this in play. So why is this approach reducing risk, right? Well, we just went through that. So let's look now at some of the sources that I used and also some of the figures and proof of this in play. Right. So this figure here was powerful to me because it shows something that we don't always see, or at least I haven't seen, right, in formal risk assessments. It was the indigenous knowledge holders were asked to identify leading threats to Pacific salmon survival, right? And so the results were specific to the region, but they were asked, right, in different areas of the region, right? So They were asked across three river systems, the Fraser, the Skeena, and the Nass. And so threats such as climate change, contaminants, aquaculture, and industrial development consistently ranked at the top. But what stood out most to me was that the prioritization, right, differed depending on the place, depending on who was asked. So that right there stood out most to me because that's a huge indicator of what my change proposes, right? So if you just take a step back and think about it, right, the prioritization of the threat differed depending on the place in where and who you asked, right? So all of these threats are present, but depending on if you asked somebody in the Fraser region or the Skeena region or the Nass region, you got a different answer as to what was to be better prioritized, right? What was a bigger threat overall and to them, right? And so what that said to me was that one area doesn't experience risk in the same way as another, right? And so the upper Fraser and the lower Fraser and the Skeena and the Nask are all experience risk differently, even though they're all presented with the same threats, right? And so this reinforces something that we've talked about all semester. This risk is not uniform, right? It's spatially structured, it's spread out, and these indigenous knowledge systems, right, we're already operating and are already operating as long-term cumulative risk assessments that are grounded in their direct observation of the environment, right? They've been doing this for centuries. So they're not ignoring this uncertainty as it is. They're trying to manage it, right? So they're actively identifying the patterns. So let's just take a closer look now at another example of this and how they're actually trying to do it. This figure here is from another one of my sources, and right, so this was contrasting just by a quick look at it from the left and right hand side. This is contrasting the traditional indigenous management systems on the left with the contemporary management systems on the right, right? So on the left, you see that the decision-making authority is locally accountable, right? It's their fisheries are there, they're in the river, they're direct observation. The governance is hereditary, as it says there, right? So it's literally passed down. And then on the other side, we see that it's centralized, right? We see big government at the top, federal policy, science, resource managers, all trickling down as it normally would, right? So this is operating at a larger scale. And yeah, the difference here is not about, rejecting the big guy, I guess you could say, but it's about looking at the scale, right? And the time it takes to respond to this, right? There's literally more links in the chain. And they're actually away from the environment, right? These people are in the environment and actually managing it because it's part of the social structure, right? So just looking at this is allowing for high rates of by integrating indigenous right knowledge systems and management systems. It's going to allow for high rates of selectivity, higher right, stronger local governance, and just incorporating things that all in all are going to increase the social aspect of the system, right? So that's something that ecosystem-based fisheries management really puts a high prize on, right? And we're looking at the entire system, not just the fish, not just the ecosystem, but the people involved in it too, right? So let's take a look now at a couple quick examples of how are they managing it, right? So what tools are they using, right? So they're targeting distinct rungs, right? Runs of fish, which gives them high rates of selectivity, right? These tools are allowing for live releases and selective harvest, right? So um, we're going to see right now, really quickly, just a couple quick ways in which they do this, right? So reef nets, dip nets, fish wheels, right? Weirs. These are all different ways and methods in which indigenous um, management implements their or does their catch, right? Actually goes out and catches the fish. So reef nets and fish reels are clearly representative of selective harvest, right? So they allow for live capture and release of non-target species, right? They even hold the fish in alive, so sort of like a holding tank, I guess you could say, until release or harvest, right? So they're allowing for one-on-one direct rates of selectivity. So in many cases today, this stuff is still used. You can see in the picture weirs are made of wood, but today they're actually sometimes made of PVC. They're able to move, pick them up, and so that way the selectivity is even higher, right? They're able to pick them up and move them at rates that might not have been done before, right? So this stuff is very, very, very selective. And so the integration of this and the integration of the monitoring aspect, right, is clearly and fundamentally ecosystem based, right? Once harvest needs are met, it's done, right? It's not driven by maximum yield or quotas. So the last thing I want to bring your attention to is one of the main things that really stuck out for me, especially that is my deciding factor, I think, in choosing this project topic and just really taking these courses, right? So salmon as ecological connectors, right? This paper really I pulled this, I used it as a source and I pulled this figure from it, but this paper just really helped me reinforce something that this whole ecosystem-based fisheries management is constantly trying to remind us of, right? They're not just fish stocks, once again, but they're connectors to this is a connector to the environment, right? So how is this stock going to be managed that it helps the environment as a whole, right? So this team right here was just looking at which you can see in your figure, all the dark lines, right? Those are all rivers that are salmon rivers, right? They're salmon, wild salmon runs, and they also have, right, bears on them. So they went out and they were trapping bears and see the connections between, right, predator-prey interactions. So this stood out to me just simply because, right, um, salmon transport marine-derived nutrients upstream in freshwater into terrestrial ecosystems, right? That's something that's been known for, I don't know, right? Years and years and years that one of the reasons why people study salmon. And bears, right, and other apex predators consume salmon and then redistribute those nutrients into riparian forests, right? So this influences everything from vegetation growth, soil chemistry, and the whole productivity of the ecosystem, right? So this specific aspect here is one of the main drivers that was the, I guess you could say, seat of my own passions. So I've actually seen these moments firsthand, and when the salmon come to town and they're swimming upstream and then they bed down and spawn and their time is over, you can bet yourself that every other creature in that forest has gotten the update and they're down on stream. Gulls will be fighting over spots and rocks, and things will get nasty and smelly. But it's very interesting, right? And so one of the facts that I point to is how the spruce trees were studied alongside salmon-bearing streams, and they've been shown to grow up to 3 times faster than salmon-free streams. When salmon decline, right, it's not just a fisheries problem. So it becomes a watershed-wide scale problem where this issue is going to be noticed, right? It just might take a longer time to see, and that's why we need to delay the response time, right, and manage things from a more ecosystem-based level. So this is exactly where harvest focused, management styles and quotas fall short. Indigenous systems have long recognized salmon as part of the broader family of life, right? Part of their life. And they've looked at these fish as they're just embedded in the nature and the ecosystem as they are, right? And so from an ecosystem-based fisheries management perspective, protecting salmon means that we're going to protect the ecosystem, right? We're going to protect the nutrient pathways, everything that I mentioned, the predator-prey dynamics, and the overall resilience of the entire ecosystem as a whole across all of the trophic levels, right? So that's not just managing fish numbers. So this is something that indigenous management recognizes, right? And so that's just the point that I wanted to make to kind of cap this off. And just quickly here, you can see that this is the questionnaire, I guess you could call it, that they were using, one of the sources there that was using the source we saw with the risk assessment. Um, this is the questionnaire that they were using to interview the indigenous knowledge holders, right? So instead of relying on that quantitative data, they were asking them about lifetime observations, abundance, harvest practices, and then all of these things boiled down to their perceived threats, right? And so this approach recognizes something that um, brings out changes, right? This approach recognizes that there's not just numbers we can collect for this, okay? So, and there's not just regular monitoring systems that we can put out to get this data, right? We actually have to get on the ground and talk to these people. and figure out what the solution may be to get a better assessment of what the risks actually are. So that's about that. My final recommendation here is just that, it's not the removal of federal oversight or any management structures. I would just like to see the expansion of, like I said, formal tribal decision-making authority right into incorporated into the existing frameworks. And I think the current examples within Western Washington already do demonstrate this, but like I said, they're treaty-based and they're not decision-making um, roles. They're not integrated into setting these policies or writing these policies, I guess you could say. So, just to draw your attention one last time, this figure, like I said, shows the percentage of households now, right? So we talked about animals, and now we're seeing people that are actually involved, right? So there can be fish in the water, but without the right governance, there certainly won't be fish in the future. Thank you, guys. Thank you for your time.